Real quick before we get started today, I just wanted to let everyone know that I started a new YouTube channel called Let's Read Clips, which basically is a completely separate YouTube channel where each video is just a solo story, so one story per video. And I'm hoping that this bite-sized content will draw in more subscribers, including yourself, that just want to get right to the action with a quick 8 to 10 minute scary story, with a new video uploaded daily. If that sounds awesome, you can find a link to the channel down below in the description or pinned comment. And I always appreciate you guys spreading the word. Thanks so much. In my early 20s, I worked in a call center for a well-known tech company. If you've ever worked in a large-scale call center, you know that it's common that you're not given assigned seating, so who you sit next to depends on your shift and desk availability. After I'd worked for my company for about 6 months, a group of new hires entered the floor. A tall, skinny man sat down next to me and said hello. I returned his greeting and accepted an incoming call right after that. As I listened to my customer, I had a chance to take a look at my desk buddy. He smelled of stale cigarettes, and his hair was greasy, and his clothes were wrinkled and obviously too large for his frame. This was no surprise, as the call center often hired people who were down on their luck. But the next few weeks would prove to be some of the most unnerving I'd ever experienced. His name was Ian. We happened to work the same shift, which began at 5 a.m. and included weekends. His energy was chaotic, and if no one was available for him to talk to, he typically spent his breaks walking quickly around the 5-floor building. He also had a habit of appearing in whatever room I happened to be in during my own breaks. If a desk close to mine was open, he would use it. When I walked out into the entryway of the building, he would be waiting by the front door. When I exited the restroom, he would be leaning against a wall in the hallway. When I took my lunch breaks, he would always walk into the break room and make a beeline for my table. He even made it a point to leave his desk and follow me into the elevators at every opportunity. If I was left alone with him, he would tell me long, meandering stories about his chaotic life and ask uncomfortable, prying questions about my life and schedule. All of this might not have been as creepy if the majority of it hadn't occurred before sunrise and in the building that was mostly unoccupied. I lacked the confidence that I now have in my early 30s, and yes, I had told my supervisor and team lead about this on several occasions with no results. On Friday morning, as I took my usual lunch break at around 9 a.m., I sat down at a table with 2 coworkers who had become friends. We had all been in the same pool of new hires. They were aware of the debacle involving Ian, and if they could, they would alert me when he was nearby. On this particular morning, my back was facing the hallway outside of the break room. As I was speaking to one of my coworkers, Brittany, her face went from warm and smiling to attentive and tense as she looked over my shoulder. When this happened, I heard Ian say very loudly, "Oh, look, there's my cute little redhead." I shrunk into my seat. I instantly wanted to run and hide. Without acknowledging anyone else at the table, Ian pulled out the chair next to mine and sat down. My coworkers gave him weak smiles, and I looked up and realized that his eyes were red and he appeared to be unsteady. I could smell hard liquor on his breath as he spoke. His clothes looked like he had been wearing them for the last 3 days. He leaned on the table, looked at me, and slurred, "Oh, why haven't we gone out to dinner yet?" Sorry, I don't date coworkers," I said flatly. Ian looked at my coworkers. "Isn't she cute?" he practically shouted. "I like you, Anna." And one of his hands flopped heavily onto one of my shoulders. Without thinking, I stood up and said to my coworkers, "I'll see you guys on the floor. I should get going." Ian looked insulted as I pushed in my chair and walked away. As I left the room, I heard him yell, "I love you." I scurried to the nearest elevator. As the doors began to close, I heard a chair scrape against the tile floor, followed by quick footsteps headed in my direction. "Why won't you talk to me? Come back!" Ian shouted. A couple of minutes later, the elevator doors opened and I shakily returned to my desk. My shift finally ended at 3 p.m. The company parking lot was huge, and on that particular day, I had to park unusually far from the front doors of the building. Remembering what my mom had taught me as a teenager, I walked to my car with my keys individually squeezed between my fingers, ready to be used as a weapon if necessary. In spite of the time of day, no one else was in the parking lot at the time. My heart thumped against my chest as my head moved on a swivel while I walked. "Hey!" A familiar voice shouted behind me. A cold shock jolted up my spine and I jumped, breaking to a jog. "Hey!" he yelled. "Don't ignore me, stop!" I could hear footsteps approaching and keys jingling from one of his pockets, and as I jogged, I gripped my car fob in my hand. From a few feet away, I double-clicked the fob, unlocking the doors. I flung the door open, leaped inside, and locked the doors behind me just as Ian approached with a furious look on his face. I looked out the window as I stuck my key in the ignition and started the engine. I threw the car into reverse, backed out before he could lock me in, threw the car back into drive, and took off. In the rearview mirror, I could see him angrily throw his hands up in the air. In that moment, I decided to call in sick the next day and then alert HR regarding my experience. Human Resources didn't seem overly concerned when I called them. No resolution was given, but when I returned to work 2 days later, Ian wasn't there. He was also absent on days 3, 4, and 5. On day 6, after my shift ended, I turned on the local news. Ian Elias, age 47, shot and killed his ex-wife. After that, he took his 2 young daughters and went across town. He then had a standoff with the police before shooting and taking his own life. His daughters were unharmed, thank goodness. As I stood in front of my TV, I felt my mouth absolutely fall open. I could hardly believe my ears. I felt faint as I recalled my last interaction with him, wondering what would have happened if he had caught up with me in his mental state at that time. Ladies, trust your instincts. If you feel uncomfortable at work, please tell Human Resources. Although I was completely unharmed, I wish I had done it sooner. Clearly, Ian had some serious mental health issues, but a part of me still feels like this was a close call. And to see this man on the news later was nothing short of absolutely surreal. This happened in the summer of 2008. My parents were going out of town for the weekend, so my girlfriend and I decided to house sit for a few days. Saturday night rolls around and we're bored from sitting around the house, so we decide to have a few friends over for a drink or two. After a low-key night of beer pong, everyone heads home and me and my girlfriend resign to my childhood bedroom and get some sleep. Several hours later, at around 3 a.m., I'm jolted awake by what sounds like someone trying to kick the front door in. I quickly jump out of bed and rush to the living room where there is a window with a view of the front porch. I look out the window and recognize the man barging on the door as my neighbor from down the street. I didn't know the guy personally, but he lived a few houses down from my parents for many years, and we waved to one another when driving past, but that was the extent of our interactions. He noticed me looking at him through the window and began pleading with me to help him. "Hey, you gotta help me. Please help me, man. They're after me. They're trying to kill me, man. Please just let me inside." The look on the man's face was one of pure terror as he begged for help and looked over his shoulder into the darkness at whoever or whatever was chasing after him. Against my better judgment, and since I knew who the guy was, I made the decision to help. As soon as I unlocked the door, the man barged in, slammed the door, and locked it behind him. He was out of breath and could barely speak. His eyes were as big as dinner plates, and he was covered in mud. "Where's your phone?" he asked. "Okay, call 911, please. They're trying to kill me." At this point, my girlfriend was already on the phone with the police, and they had officers en route. The man began frantically running around the house, ensuring that all of the doors and windows were locked. He got to a window and looked through the blinds. "Here they come!" he yelled. "There's 10 of them, and they all got guns. They're gonna kill us!" It took me a few moments to get my bearings. I was woken from a dead sleep less than a minute ago, and my brain was not able to comprehend all of the chaos that had ensued. The man grabbed my shoulders and began shaking me. "Did you hear me? They're gonna kill us, man! Where are your guns?" I guess that was the time I snapped out of the fog and realized the danger that we were in. I sprung into action and ran to retrieve my dad's shotgun from the closet. I loaded the gun and began shoving handfuls of shotgun shells into my pocket to prepare for the gunfight that I would soon be in. The man sprinted past me down the hall toward the pulled-down attic stairs. "They're coming. We need to climb into the attic. It's our only chance of survival." He pulled down the attic stairs and ran up. My girlfriend began climbing up after him, but I stopped her. Something about this doesn't seem right. I peeked my head up to the attic and saw the man stumbling around and talking gibberish to himself. I continued to watch him for a few more seconds, and he began yelling in various directions and swinging a broomstick in the air aimlessly. And that's when it clicked. The house isn't under attack. This guy was nuts. I just let a psycho into the house at 3 a.m. and put myself and my girlfriend in danger. My girlfriend calls the police back for a second time to update them on the situation. The dispatcher told her that an officer would be arriving at any minute, and I need to put the gun away before the police arrive. I stashed the shotgun but did not want to remain unarmed, so I grabbed a baseball bat and took my girlfriend out to the front yard to wait for the police while keeping an eye on the house in case the psycho decided to come after us. Seconds later, a police cruiser drove right past the house. It turns out that my girlfriend gave them the wrong address. We began running towards the street in an attempt to flag down the police car when we heard a loud crash from the house behind us. We were sprinting down my parents' long driveway when the man bursted out of the front door and began chasing after us. When we turned the corner on the street, I saw the police officer and continued to run as fast as I could in his direction. The next thing I knew, the cop had his gun drawn and pointed at me, yelling, "Drop the weapon and get on the ground." Amidst the chaos, I guess I didn't realize that running full speed toward a police officer with a baseball bat in my hand is not the best idea. As I'm trying to explain that we were the ones who called 911, gunshots ring out from the next door. Turns out that when the crazy man saw the police car, he stopped chasing us and ran to the neighbor's house where he busted through a window to break in. After waking up from hearing glass shatter, the neighbor, who was an old man in his late 80s living alone, rolled out of bed and retrieved the pistol from his nightstand, but it was too late. The crazy man had already found his way to the bedroom and disarmed the old man before he could get a shot off. The crazy man took the gun and began firing rapidly down the hallway. When the police officer heard the gunfire, he realized that I was not a threat and began running toward the house where the shots came from. All of a sudden, it seemed like every cop in the area showed up. I was told to stay put by the patrol car and to not move. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only a couple of minutes, I heard a lot of yelling and the police telling the man to get on the ground. It wasn't long after that when the officer that I had the initial interaction with approached me and told me to follow him because they needed me to positively identify the man as the one who was in my house. The cop led me around to the neighbor's house, the backyard, and there he was, crazy man, handcuffed and laying in the grass, still mumbling nonsense to himself. I told the cops they had the right man, and off he went, to jail. After talking to the police for a while and giving my statement, they asked to see my parents' house where the incident began. When we got there and walked through the front door, it looked like a bomb went off. There was a huge hole in the kitchen ceiling. Drywall and pluffs of pink insulation were everywhere. And I come to find out, when the crazy man was stumbling around in the attic, he tripped over a box and fell straight through the ceiling onto my parents' kitchen table. After conducting their investigation, the police discovered that crazy man was on a meth binge and hadn't slept for several days prior to the incident. In his tweaked out state, he truly believed that people were trying to kill him. During an interview, he also admitted that when he took the neighbor's gun, he was shooting at the imaginary people who were chasing him down the hallway. In his mind, he was in a life or death situation. Police told us how lucky we were that nobody was hurt or killed during the whole ordeal. Lesson learned. I won't be opening the door for anyone in the middle of the night, ever again. I've had my fair share of scary and just plain weird experiences as someone who has worked in both the hotel industry and the hospital's ER. I feel like I'm fairly equipped as a person to keep my brain from melting down in scenarios where I should be just absolutely freaking out. Of the many frightening stories I have, this is the one that has always shaken me up the most. I worked at a popular hotel chain from when I was 18 to when I was 20. I worked front desk, and at the time of this story, I was the primary evening shift attendant from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. However, I would sometimes cover night shifts, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. At the time of this story, I was a 19-year-old girl working alone in a hotel during the night shift. There were no other hotel employees in the building, just me. This particular brand of hotel chain was cheaper, not as luxurious or even as well regarded as some of the other brands in the chain. We were also situated right off the highway, so we got a lot of walk-ins and drug addicts and other strange people on a regular basis, although this is true of any hotel, not just the cheaper ones. We had a couple and their baby walk in at about 12 a.m. to see if we had a room, and since it was fall and the busy season was wrapping up, we did. They seemed nice, like a regular, normal young couple. Again, I saw weird people every day, so maybe my radar for this sort of thing was skewed. I'm doing my thing during my shift, beginning the audit process, cleaning up around the lobby and watching Netflix on my phone when I get a call to the desk at around 1 a.m. It's one of the rooms on the second floor complaining about a noise complaint, saying that someone down the hall is making a ruckus and could I please have them stop. I ask if they know what room it is, and they don't. I'm not allowed to leave the desk for any reason, as if someone calls or comes into the hotel, there would be no one there and the safe is located up front. I tell the guest to call back if the noise continues. After 10 minutes later, they call back and tell me to call the police because they can hear more clearly that they are arguing. I ask them their room number and immediately go into crisis mode. I take the stairs up to where the guest is calling from on the second floor, and I can hear the screaming before I even get up one flight of stairs. I can't describe it. It sounds like someone was being murdered from the blood-curdling way she was screaming. I'm a 5'5", 19-year-old girl, so I immediately get 911 on the cell phone. The protocol in this situation is to call the manager first to get her permission for an emergency call, but screw it, you know. I peek my head up through the doorway and look down the hallway, and I see the man from the young couple earlier, and he is just beating the absolute life out of his girlfriend. She's holding their baby, just screaming and crying in the middle of the hallway. Meanwhile, I'm telling the operator as much as I can, and I have to somehow find the courage to try and break the situation up. Every instinct in me tells me to just go back downstairs and barricade myself in the manager's office and get myself out of danger. But I am seriously frightened that this man is either going to kill this woman or their baby. I put on my bravest, loudest, strongest voice and shout down the hallway. I don't even know what I said, but it probably wasn't even real words. They both look at me and my blood runs just absolutely cold. I yell to the woman and ask her, "Are you okay, ma'am?" She clearly isn't. Her face is just red and black and bleeding, and she's still sobbing and screaming, and their newborn is wailing. She doesn't even answer. She just scrambles up from the wall and just runs to me. The guy stays standing right there in the hall looking at us, just dumbstruck. I lead her down to the front desk and have her join me behind the desk. I tell her that I have police on the phone and the operator asks to speak to her if possible, so I hold her baby, and she's sobbing on the phone about her boyfriend and about how he's trying to kill her. She's providing the details about her boyfriend when I hear banging from the staircase, and I just know. I'm outright shaking, but I hand her baby back as this guy bursts out of the stairway just fuming about his girlfriend. It's like I'm not even there, and he can't even see me. He is pinpointed on her. I'm fairly convinced that tonight is going to be the night that I'm about to die. I don't even realize it, but I'm crying now too, out of shock or just as a reaction or maybe anger, I don't know. I put myself between him and this girl and I tell him that he needs to leave the premises now. He clearly doesn't listen to that. I take the rolling chair that I have been sitting on and use it as a barricade between the door to the front desk and us. And that's when I see that he has a knife. This is when it starts to get a little hazy for me. I can only remember in clarity how hard my heart was beating and my ears ringing, just the sheer terror that I was feeling when I see this guy coming at us and his baby. I don't particularly remember how it worked, but I remember throwing the rolling chair at him while screaming something that was meant to be like, "Get away," but was probably not anything like that. I take this girl by her arm and I'm dragging her with me. I practically throw her and her baby into the nearby boiler room, and then I throw myself in afterwards and close the door. It's a small, durable room and the only room in the hotel where the door is made out of solid metal. It locks immediately and I don't even turn on the lights. We're sitting there, crouched together in this dark room. I brace myself against the door as he starts to just pound on it with his whole body weight, like I'm going to have any notable effect against this guy. I can hear the operator asking for us from where she dropped my phone somewhere on the ground, the light barely illuminating the both of us. We're both just crying and breathing and shaking. She's trying to comfort her baby, and for some reason, I take off the jacket I'm wearing and offer it to her for her face. Like that's the most important thing in the moment or something. Thankfully, our location to the highway meant that the officers were there fairly quickly. They arrest the guy without problem, and we get ourselves out of the boiler room. The paramedics come and check her out and take her to the nearby hospital. They tell me to come with them. I had a cut on my arm through the jacket from the knife, and I don't even know when or where or how I got it. I genuinely have no memory of it. It didn't even hurt, and thankfully it's just shallow and it didn't even scar, but I for some reason refused because I have to finish my shift. I get my phone back, call my manager, and by now several guests have flocked to the lobby to chatter amongst themselves at the commotion. One of them tells me, I heard them fighting, but I didn't want to get out of bed. My manager comes to the hotel and tells me to go to the hospital and then to go home. I end up sitting in the ER with the lady, and I spent the rest of that morning as her guest, looking after her baby as she was treated in the ER for a multitude of injuries. She was released around 9 a.m. that morning, and she thanked me profusely. I don't even think I ever learned her name. I don't know where she went to after that, or if she's okay, or what happened to her, hopefully ex-boyfriend. I don't know if he went to jail. They don't tell you that sort of thing. I took the next week off of work, and I was never able to work night shift again. It was just too scary being in that place alone with no one to back me up. I hope she's okay. I hope she's doing all right, and I hope her kid is all right too. I hope she has healed and grown past what was obviously a very traumatic time in her life. I don't know the answers, and I don't think I'll ever know, but that's how life is sometimes. I think about her all the time, even though it's been years. It's just so sad knowing that this is something common that happens all the time, all around the world. I know it easily could have ended up so badly for her and for me, and I'm just so grateful that it didn't. When I was in high school, I didn't have any friends. I mean, I wasn't the kid sitting on their own in the corner of the schoolyard kind of thing. I just didn't have any solid friendships or groups. However, my second cousin, who was related to me through being fostered by a distant relative, was in the same year level as me. Through being somewhat related, we became friendly and I was introduced to a small trio of mates. I shared similar interests with them like computers, video games, books, and war stuff, so I didn't mind hanging out with them. Now, my cousin was always strange. Weird and strange and peculiar, I'd say, but I'd accepted this as fairly sort of an eccentric person myself, and I pretty much put it down to him being a foster kid with a rough upbringing. Apparently his biological mom's addiction is what led to him being taken by child services and ended up in a foster home. Sad, I know, but not uncommon, unfortunately. Although with his odd behavior, the other guys and I suspected that my cousin was also gay. It was more of an uncomfortable, humorous suspicion based on his flamboyant personality and touchy-feely antics. There were a few times when we'd all play fight, wrestle, and get each other in headlocks and all that kind of stuff, and we swore that one time he was, should we say, physically aroused from it. Needless to say, we avoided any physical interaction from then on. Now, don't get me wrong, we weren't against him or anything like that, but you can imagine the level of discomfort we felt, especially since we were just 14. Regardless of the strangeness of my cousin, I was dealing with an alcoholic father on a daily basis and a subsequent turbulent home life myself, so I think I stayed friends with him in a kind of kindred spirit way, based on the account of us both having screwed up families. Now, to continue the story, it's important that I describe this next part, and I hope it makes sense to any non-Australians. In my town, there are a whole bunch of high schools scattered across the area, but when students have to finish year 10 from their respective colleges, and then move on to year 11 and 12 before they graduate, almost every student is sent to the same big school, right in the middle of town. Strange concept, I know, but it's kinda cool that every public school teenager in town spends 2 years all together. You meet new people, attend big parties, and pretty much forget about the last 4 years that you spent at your old school. Importantly, though, when you attend this particular school, you have complete autonomy and responsibility for your own class attendance. So if you want to skip any periods and just walk into the city to get some chips and gravy, buy some clothes or music, or just loiter, there's nothing to stop you. So you can imagine what it's like to go from being under constant authority for 4 years to suddenly attending a new big school in the middle of town with complete freedom to come and go as you liked. So with the school being in the center of town, there was a big public park that served as the school's unofficial grounds, and importantly to the story, neighboring the main campus building was a primary school. Like me, my cousin wasn't too interested in studying, and the newfound freedom only enhanced our apathy towards school, particularly attendance. We'd walked into town, buy coffee and food from the cheap bakery, and spend hours at the Land Cafe playing Command and Conquer Generals in Battlefield 1942. Yep, that gives you an idea of what time period this took place in. Now one day, as I was expecting that we would visit our usual haunt, my cousin tells me that he's heading next door to the primary school and I should come along. Apparently, he'd been granted access to the school to help children read and had been doing this for some time. As someone who loves reading, grammar, and literature in general, I thought, that sounds fun. So we enter the primary school. The whole time, my cousin is leading the way, and we walk up the main stairs, through the corridor, and into a busy, noisy classroom. The teacher of the classroom acknowledges us and continues on with her work without really paying any attention. Strangely, I didn't even have to explain why I was there. I remember listening to kids who must have been in grade 3 or 4 reading and helping them pronounce words, etc., and thinking to myself, surely this all must be legit. But how odd is it that we just kind of walked into this like that? I happen to notice that my cousin is spending pretty much the entire time with one particular student. He seems to have a familiarity with this boy, and he even introduces me to the kid. The boy seems happy to see my cousin, and my cousin likewise. Must be his favorite student, I thought, and went back to listening to the reading. The second time he took me to the school, the teacher of the classroom was not expecting us. I can vaguely remember her saying something like she didn't know anything about it and it was best that we come back another time. It was a weird thought, but maybe there really was just some mix-up and the teacher wasn't notified of us. In case you were wondering why I kept going, I had always shown an interest in education, and at one point I even studied for 3 years to become a primary school teacher, until changing career choices for something a little less stressful. However, the third time my cousin asked me to join him, I agreed. But this time, it was different, and I never went there again. As we were approaching the main campus building with him leading the way as usual, I got a strange feeling. It was a different time of the day compared to the last 2 times, and there seemed to be a lack of confidence in my cousin. Upon approaching the door, he seemed nervous, like he's really reluctant to go in. He hesitates as he pushes the entrance doors open and sort of creeps through the hallway, up to the stairs, cautiously looking out for somebody. We make it to the stairs and into the corridor just outside the classroom, and he's kind of just hesitating to do anything, all the while with this sort of creepy, cheeky grin on his face. This time, the classroom isn't noisy. There's no hustle and bustle, just quiet murmuring coming from inside. I can distinctly remember thinking, we're really not meant to be here, are we? And I asked my cousin what exactly it was that he was doing here. Are they expecting us this time? He still had that disturbing, presumptuous grin on his face. Assuming that they were indeed not expecting us again and we might get into trouble, I left. I just thought in that incident that my cousin was just being audacious. I mean, he was an audacious person, stealing money from his parents, hacking the school's admin and so forth, so I just thought that was another aspect of his juvenility. That was until one day, as we were chatting, he mentioned the boy from the classroom, the one I saw him so fixated on. He told me that he had still been going over to the school to see him, to talk to him not only in the classroom, but also at the playground. My cousin also said that he'd seen him outside of the school and that he'd actually gone to watch him play soccer on the weekend, and he was planning on going again next Saturday. Yeah, that's when the alarm bells went off in my head. Even more confronting was that he even proposed visiting the boy's house. I can't remember how I reacted or what I even said. I think I just did the whole, oh, okay. And in my mind, being like, what the actual F? I started to put all the pieces together. The constant visits to the school, the trespassing and sneaking into the campus. He was never, ever meant to be there. There was no helping the kids read. There was no assisting the teacher. None. It was all a cover to see this one boy. My cousin, only 16 years old, was stalking a child, and I was the only one who knew it. After much thought, I eventually decided to contact our school's assistant principal. It was more of a, this is something to be concerned about, right? And I briefly told her everything I knew, what my cousin had said and what he was doing and what I had seen. I received a reply email and she was, well, very interested to talk to me. I can remember sitting in her office, a large room with old portraits and books, thinking that I'm way over my depth here. I was soiling myself, thinking that I was going to get in trouble for being an accomplice or something and that I just opened the lid of something bigger than I can handle. But the assistant principal was supportive, and after a few face-to-face meetings, the school took action. I don't know what they actually did, but my cousin was definitely banned from even going near the primary school. He dropped out, or might have even been expelled, I don't know, but he just kind of vanished. I also think that the police were notified too, and subsequently, this must have put him on their radar, because the story doesn't quite end here. A few years later, I saw an article in the local newspaper. It was concerning a local man who had been arrested for grooming a child and suspiciously observing and stalking the grounds of a primary school on a constant basis. His home was raided and his computers were confiscated. The hard drives were loaded with illicit images of children and personal photographs, and after numerous charges, he was consequently jailed. Interestingly, the man's name was printed in the article, and as you guessed it was none other than my cousin. I was shocked, but oddly, not surprised. And I think, did I, without knowing, begin a process all those years ago that led to the apprehension of a predator? What if I had ignored it and not taken action, and in not doing so, prevented something much, much worse? When I was only 9 years old, I got a psychiatrist. It was 2014 then, and his office was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I had gotten a psychiatrist because of anger issues. I have ODD and autism. He was always amazing. I had huge respect for him. His name was Mark, and he was in his early 40s when we met. He was super bright and charming and heartwarming. He really felt more like a family friend because he treated me so nice. My mom liked Mark, and the rest of my siblings who needed a psychiatrist got Mark as their psychiatrist. My mom thought that he was great at times, but slowly, he had some problems with him. Now, these problems weren't super big, they just set her in a weird mood, I guess. One instance was where my older sister Alex was talking to him about her father, I think, and how crazy he is, and I remember my mom telling me Mark talked about his ex-wife and told Alex to call him these vulgar names. Mark definitely had some issues going on. We all could see that he was selfless. He spent his own money on toys to help me fidget so I don't have my tics as much. He had this expanding ball. It was made out of these colored, bendy, wiry things. It's hard to explain what it was, but I loved it. Now fast forward a few years, and Mark and I have gotten quite close. I've always loved going to his office for an appointment. Him and I talked about my abusive father a lot. This is when he moved offices to Mequon, Wisconsin. My father was supposed to take counseling with me in autism classes, but he refused, and that upset me since at the time I wanted a relationship with my father. I remember this quote the day we talked about my dad. It went something a little like, "People are a-holes. They're born like that. Some people turn into a-holes, but your dad was born one. Those people suck up the enjoyment of other people's so they could just feel good inside. Don't ever turn into an a-hole." That statement sticks with me to this day. Now, around New Year's Eve 2017, my insurance company wasn't going to be accepted by the start of 2018, so Mark and I had to say goodbye. When our last session came to an end, him and I hugged. He was such a warm person. I'm tearing up writing this, and he felt like family to me. He told my mom if we can't find a new psychiatrist that we could always take sessions at his house. The place closed down in February 2018, so Mark did sessions at his home. I found a psychiatrist soon after. Fast forward to September of 2018, and I was getting ready for school when my mom came in to tell me that Mark had died. I was baffled. I asked if he had taken his own life, and my mom told me in the affirmative that that's what happened. The initial story was that he shot someone in the back of the head and shot himself, but a year later the real story came out. His ex-boyfriend came over during a session and they started arguing. His ex then pulled out a revolver and shot Mark in the back of the head and then took his life. I remember reading about it and Mark said a few minutes before his murder, "Can we not do this in front of my kid?" And this broke me while reading it. Initially I was angry about Mark, but I found out the truth around a year and a half ago. It makes me mad that the media painted Mark as the killer for a year. People don't keep up with updates, so most think that Mark was actually the murderer, but he wasn't. Mark was bright. He was loving, enthusiastic. He was an amazing person. I'm always creeped out that if I never found a psychiatrist, that I could have had a session that late August day and witnessed something absolutely horrific. Please, enjoy people's company before it's too late. I didn't enjoy his company enough, and I now live with the guilt of that. This story happened today. I'm shocked, to say the least. I'm a 20-year-old female and this happened this morning. I live in California in a small county that has spread out communities. I had to go 2 hours to the nearest city to get a tire for a car, and we were getting ready to head out towards the city. I had to stop by the store to get a coffee and a payday bar, so I get into the store to get my items and I realize something is seriously wrong in the store. For starters, the ladies in the store are always cheery and happy. They were not, which I thought was odd. I asked the owner what was going on while the other cashier was on the phone. She didn't answer, so I had to wait until the cashier got off the phone and they said quietly that there is an active shooter who shot and killed someone in another town over and was headed our way. I started to pay for my items, and this old man comes in and he looks like he was in his late 30s, early 40s. He had a long beard and a camo Carhartt jacket on. It was acting really weird to where I got a bad vibe from him, but that was about it. He smacked a $20 bill on the counter, but keep in mind, I'm not done with my transaction. I looked at him, and his response is, "I'm sorry," in a whisper, which I thought was so strange. As I'm leaving the store, I saw a black SUV car in the parking lot that I assumed was his car. I get to the car and told my fiancée what was going on, and how there was an active shooter 10 miles from where I lived, and we were heading in that direction. As we were on the road, and we see an alarming amount of cop cars on the road and EMS. And that's when we knew this was serious. This black car came up behind my fiancé, pulled over thinking it was a cop car, and he sped off so fast that all of a sudden, the police cars flipped back over and were chasing towards that black SUV, but I didn't think much of it. Now we get to the city and we drive past feds and SWAT, and I kid you not, we saw a SWAT team heading to the small town I mentioned. The active shooter had killed 2 people, and while I was in the city, he went there to where I used to live, barricaded the doors, and took the family who lived there hostage. I head home and went to the store previously as mentioned, and I got confirmation that he took his own life after the police feds sat outside his house for 6 hours. The man in the store who smacked the $20 bill in front of me was the active shooter. So in the end, a normal person who has been loved and been a part of the community can kill somebody and you wouldn't even know until they snap. As I began writing this, I'm surprised to recall how many near-death experiences I've had. From a horrific car accident to being nearly trampled by a moose, God has kept himself busy by sparing my life up to this point. But today's story revolves around an event that nearly killed myself and 6 other family members. I lived in southeastern Idaho. It's a beautiful and scenic part of the West. The mountains tower so high that I can see both Montana and Wyoming from my house. An hour north of home is a region called Island Park, and is hands down one of my favorite places to vacation. The area is nestled inside an enormous volcanic caldera, which was born out of the same hotspot that created nearby Yellowstone National Park. The rugged countryside is blanketed by tall lodgepole pine trees and is home to some of the best fishing this side of the Mississippi. Some of my best memories have been made there. Youth conferences, musical retreats, cabin trips, boating, hiking, you name it. I'm currently married and a father of 4. I love my family and enjoy nothing more than getting out of the house for a little adventure with them. Come summer of 2020, we had just recently purchased our first family-sized tent and were anxious to get out and camp. To make things even more fun, we invited my wife's parents along with her sister and her husband to join us for a weekend up in Island Park. My father-in-law, Kurt, had access to his dad's boat, which made us all the more excited to go. One of the main attractions of Island Park is the reservoir. Nestled at the foot of Sawtell Peak, the large reservoir is lined with collections of cabins, docks, boat ramps, and a private resort. It's practically paradise. During our trip, we planned to spend Friday camping, then head out on the water on Saturday for a day of water skiing and tubing. Before leaving, I had to check the weather in case we needed to expect any rain. The forecast had predicted a chance of rain on Saturday, but given that it was only a 50% chance, I figured it wouldn't be much of a hindrance to our recreation. When we arrived at the boat ramp that Saturday, it was picturesque. The sun was beaming down on us, and the only clouds you could see were miles away. As far as I was concerned, we'd gotten lucky and were spared the annoyance of a storm breaking up the day. Given that this was 2020, everyone and their dog had descended onto every outdoor venue between here and Jackson Hole. Months of pandemic restrictions had pushed people to spend more time outdoors where the restrictions simply just didn't exist. The dirt parking lot was absolutely full, with lines of trucks slowly delivering boats onto the large boat ramp that dipped into the south shore of the lake. After some waiting, we finally got our turn to put in. I helped back up the trailer into the water while Kurt directed the boat out towards the dock adjacent to the ramp. The boat itself wasn't huge. I'm no expert, but it's what you might expect for that kind of occasion. The bow had a horseshoe-shaped bench seat that ran all along the front. Spanning the center was a windshield with a hinged center pane that could open so passengers could move along the aisle to the back of the boat. Next sat a row of bucket seats for the driver and a passenger, with another 2 rows of seats facing each other in the stern. As we began loading the boat, it began showing signs of engine trouble. At one point, it completely died, which was ironic considering my wife's grandpa had just gotten it tuned up at a local shop. Kurt, myself, and my brother-in-law, Josh, set about inspecting the engine to determine the problem. Best we could tell, it was the battery, which then required us to detach the trailer, pull the SUV back onto the ramp, and jumpstart the boat. Luckily, it started back up, but this meant that we couldn't turn off the boat and risk it dying out in the middle of the lake. I saw this all as a mere inconvenience when I should have considered it an omen. At last, we set sail with all 10 of us on board, including our 4 kids who were all under the ages of 7. After buzzing around for a while, our 2 youngest kids began asking when we could go eat. Given our delayed start, it was already lunchtime. Not wanting to cut the fun short, we decided my mother-in-law would take the younger kids back to camp while we stayed out on the water. While heading back to the dock, we all began to notice a distant mass of dark clouds forming to the west. Once we had dropped the other 3 off, we debated about whether we should risk going back out, if a storm seemed to be approaching. In a situation like this, I tend to be the one who says, "It'll be fine." We put a lot of time and effort into getting there, and considering that I make it onto a boat maybe once a year, I wasn't about to simply cancel it all because we might get a little rain. My wife tends to be much more of a worrier and was encouraging us to just stay and maybe come back later. Now somehow, we all agreed to go back out and just keep an eye on the storm. Any signs of lightning, then that would be our signal to get out. As we set out again, we headed towards the northeastern end of the lake. Here it begins to narrow and wind into the trees like a snake, to the point where it almost looks like a wide river. There were far less boats here, and it looked to be a safe place to start water skiing. Josh went first, only crashing a couple of times and managing to stay up for a good while. I volunteered to go next. By this time, the sky had morphed into gray, and from our view northward, we could see dark clouds beginning to envelope Sawtell Peak. You know those storms where the sun still managed to shine through open pockets in the clouds? It was like that. This beautiful contrast of billowing white and gray clouds with misty curtains of rain reaching towards the ground, while bright golden rays of sunshine permeate through like arrows shooting towards the ground. It was a stunning scene, and a facade that masked the danger that laid ahead of us. Given the scene, my wife asked that I consider staying in the boat and that we start heading back. Being my stubborn, adrenaline-starved self, I pleaded that we go a little longer. We decided 10 minutes tops. I slid into the water, which was very cold considering that we were up in the mountains and it was likely fresh ice melt. I'm lousy at water skiing since I'd never done it enough to get good at it. After my second failed attempt at getting up out of the water, we saw our first strike of lightning. It was a mile or two north of Sawtell. It was close enough to light a fire up my butt. Time to go. As quickly as I could, I swam back to the boat, and once in, we hightailed it back in the direction that we had come. Almost on cue, we began feeling the pitter-patter of raindrops as an eastward wind began to pick up. Thunder rumbled from behind us, and given how narrow the lake was at that point, a wall of tall pines obstructed our view to the west. It wasn't until we rounded a bend that opened up to the open lake that we got a full view of what laid ahead. In the moment that we had before an angry wall of rain fully hit us, I felt a rush of both awe and terror. The once pristine and calm blue water had transformed into a roiling mass of white cress, and the sky was nothing more than a curtain of rain under a ceiling of furious black clouds. When people think of dangerous storms on the water, most picture the ocean, but storms over large lakes can cause massive swells too. I couldn't believe how quickly everything had changed. It couldn't have been more than 45 minutes since we had last been at that spot, and the storm had apparently been far away at that time. It felt like it had snuck up on us, like a hungry beast stealthily trapping its prey. Within seconds, we were hit with a barrage of rain. The droplets were so large that it felt like small pebbles peppering our skin. Aside from our life jackets, we were only wearing swimsuits, so there was little in the way of protection from the elements. From where I was sitting on the back seat, I had a full view of everyone in the boat. To my left was Josh trying to helplessly shield his face from the rain. In the middle of the boat, between the forward-facing driver and passenger seats, sat my wife, her sister, and my 2 kids. One held towels over the kids while the other was hurriedly looking around for any other form of protection. She managed to find 2 square flotation pads, which she then held them over their heads like umbrellas, and Kurt was at the wheel, crouching down low enough to keep his eyes under the protection of the windshield. I don't know exactly how fast we were going or the speed of the opposing winds blowing against us, but it felt like I had stuck my head out of the car window on a highway. I was finding it hard to breathe, both from the wind and the ice-cold rain that was relentlessly drenching my barely covered body. For the first 30 seconds or so, Josh and I exchanged surprised looks and exclamations like, "This is insane," or "Holy crap, dude." We knew the situation was shocking, but it didn't feel life-threatening yet. It wasn't until the waves hit us that the real fear began to set in. The boat began to bounce in short successive bursts, until suddenly we felt the bow dip down and swiftly pitch back upward again. These weren't small waves like you encounter in the wake of another boat. These were big, far bigger than any I had experienced firsthand on a lake. Each time the bow dipped and plunged into a crest, water would rush over the front rails and into the boat. It wasn't enough to fill the boat, but my fear at that moment was the possibility of being capsized, especially if the battery happened to die on us again. Despite the fact that we all wore life jackets, it is possible that a capsize could trap someone underneath and injure them, or simply leave us at the mercy of the raging water. As a confident swimmer, I was less than worried about myself, and all the more worried about my wife and kids. Should they find themselves out of the boat, it's entirely possible that they could still drown by being tossed and pushed under the surface. With squinted eyes, I tried to survey the surrounding waters. Through the sheets of rain, I could make out at least a dozen other boats, all converging on the boat ramp that still lay at least several hundred yards ahead of us. They all must have been equally as surprised by the storm as we were, because I could also see that the boat ramp was jam full of trucks and trailers frantically trying to get their boats out of the water. With this being our only way out, this meant everyone else was stuck on the lake until space opened up on the ramp. My skin burned with the force of everything hitting it. Kurt was white-knuckling the boat against the storm, his shoulders hunched and head down like a linebacker. We seemed to be keeping the boat under as much control as we could manage, making sure to hit waves head-on so as to avoid flipping. My poor kids were terrified. Despite the shelter the women provided, they were soaked and freezing in the midst of a violent storm that had us all screaming at each other just to be heard. I could see the dread in everyone's eyes, an expression of disbelief and fear of being plunged into a potentially deadly situation. As we approached the ramp, it was clear that our only option to disembark would be to try and position the boat against the dock. However, this dock was not built into the ground on pylons. This was a floating dock, made to lay on top of the water as levels rose and fell during the year. It was anchored to a single post high on the shore, which meant that in these conditions it was a moving target. Kurt positioned the boat about 50 yards to the windward side of the dock, intending to essentially let the wind and water push us against the dock and hopefully provide enough stability to let us get out. That point in the journey was by far the most terrifying. In this position, we were now parallel with the waves, meaning that we were now vulnerable to being capsized if we didn't reach the dock in time. In perhaps a vain effort to maintain stability, us men positioned ourselves on the right side of the boat, hoping our weight could keep the side of the boat from rising too steep. Slowly we drifted over, anticipating that once we were close enough we could have to try and get everyone off without someone getting crushed between the boat and the dock. The closer we got, the clearer I could see fellow boaters frantically mounting boats onto their trailers, then signaling for drivers to go before they even had time to get off the boats themselves, all in an effort to get as many people off the water as possible. Fortunately, we came within the reach of the dock without tipping. Kurt maintained control while Josh and I grabbed hold of the dock, trying to stabilize the boat as it bounced against the side. Once I got off, I immediately reached back to get the kids out. They were sobbing and struggling to move while my wife handed them up to me. That was the first moment that I felt some level of relief, knowing that at the very least the kids were out of the water. Josh helped lead them up the dock while my wife and her sister disembarked, leaving Kurt at the wheel. Over the roar of the storm, Kurt shouted for me to try and help the boat from floating away while he went to fetch the trailer, though he would have had to leave the engine idling to avoid another possible battery failure. Seconds later, Josh returned. He and I grabbed onto the metal mooring brackets while Kurt disembarked and sprinted up to the parking lot. Given the roughness of the water, neither of us could try and find rope or fenders to cushion the boat banging against the dock. So there we stayed, kneeling down and doing our best to keep the boat from either drifting away or crashing against us too hard. Since it was still idling, it slowly began pushing itself toward the shore until eventually it nudged up against the concrete ramp underneath us. With each series of waves, we could feel the hull scraping against it, but there was nothing more we could do other than pray that the damage wouldn't be too drastic. Sitting there trying to patiently wait for the trailers was agonizing. It felt like sitting under a freezing cold shower. The rain continued to bear down on our bare skin like rocks, the wind blowing so hard that it was almost coming down sideways. My entire body was shivering so hard that it felt like a seizure. It was difficult to speak coherently, let alone grip the heavy boat and keep it somewhere anchored. Strangely enough, the only slight bit of physical comfort at that moment was the lake water as it splashed up onto the dock. Remember how I said the lake water was fresh ice melt? Well, compared to the rain and wind, it felt surprisingly warm. So every couple of seconds, a wave would splash us and give a very brief sensation of warmth. We knew Kurt could move only so fast. The ramp was still packed with trucks and trailers while boats were struggling to position themselves properly and avoid hitting each other. So we waited and held on. Looking out across the lake, I wondered at how we had made it back safely. It literally looked like rough seas. Having lived in this region most of my life, storms like this were extremely rare. And while weather in the mountains can change quickly and drastically, I'd never seen something this extreme. It felt and looked like a monsoon or a hurricane. I don't know how long it took, but at long last we could see Kurt's trailer making its way down the ramp. Once he was in position, he had to climb back into the boat and maneuver it around the dock. From what I could tell, we were some of the last ones to get out. We did our best to guide the boat onto the trailer, standing in the now warm-feeling water until it felt secure. I jumped into the SUV and drove us up the ramp and onto the now muddy parking lot. After gathering a few personal items from the boat, I was finally able to climb into the second row seats where my wife was waiting for me with a towel. It was finally over. I don't know if it was purely just due to the cold, but I was convulsing. My muscles felt tight and strained, and while they had the heat dialed all the way up, it was like the cold had penetrated all the way into my body and didn't want to let go. My wife kept asking if I was okay and what was wrong. I must have had a stunned look on my face because the worry in her expression said it all. As we drove back towards camp, I finally began to thaw and regain control of my hands. We all chattered in disbelief at what we had just experienced. One minute we were having a good old time, and the next we were on the brink of drowning. It all happened so fast. It wasn't until we reached the camp that the storm began to subside. The shock seemed to wear off relatively quickly as we began cooking dinner and carried on with the remainder of our trip. I think we were all just relieved that everyone came away from this experience relatively unharmed, at least physically. It's been 3 years now, and my wife and daughter are still nervous about getting onto boats. I did feel a measure of guilt for having not been more cautious and just playing it safe. I wasn't the only one who wanted to continue boating that day, but I certainly was stubborn about it. And that desire for fun put us all into a dangerous situation, especially for my kids. While I still love adventure and taking reasonable risks, this nightmare really reined me in. Whenever I'm out with my family, even for something harmless like a hike, I'm always on high alert with my eyes on my surroundings. Nature is something to fear and respect. Feeling the raw power of a relentless storm that couldn't care less about you, it's a deeply humbling experience. Thank you, God, for sparing me once again. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. I was a 12-year-old boy in 1982 living in condos behind McChesney Park in McChesney Park, Illinois. I had a small patio with a plastic wading pool. I was a 5'3" chubby ginger kid. A few boys, maybe 6 and 7, would come over and jump into the wading pool and pet my dog Bruno almost daily. One day their big sister, 14, cute too, asked to come swim. Sure, I thought. We talked music, MTV videos, and Adam and the Ants. She asked if I had popsicles. Nope, sorry. She said, follow me. We'll go get one at my house. We walked 4 condos down and went in. I said, can I use your restroom? And sure, she said. I went upstairs as she was down in the kitchen. As I approached the bathroom, a naked younger sister about 10 years old stepped out of the bathroom and screamed, ran back into the bathroom and slammed the door. I yelled sorry. I didn't know anyone else was up there. I went down and told the 14-year-old, and she just laughed. We grabbed popsicles and headed to the condo park swings. After the swinging and popsicles, she left to go spend the night at a friend's condo a few blocks away. I was picked up by my friend and his mother and driven to a sand park pool in Loves Park, Illinois after an afternoon of swimming. An hour into my fun, police showed up at Sand Park Pool. I was called by name over a speaker to the concession area where everyone saw me be placed into handcuffs and taken by police. They drove me to the girl's condo where the 10-year-old younger sister identified me as the man who broke into her home, went up to her room, and tried to get her when she locked herself into her bathroom and waited an hour for Mom to get home. Her father saw me, confused as I looked like the ginger kid in Sandlot. I cried and explained that I was with her older sister getting a popsicle and went up to try to use the bathroom. They went and got the older sister, and she verified my story. Everyone but me laughed. All was well, and an officer offered to take me back to Sand Park Pool. I left with him and we drove off. He wouldn't speak to me. He pulled off on a dirt road. He aimed the rearview mirror over to me and stopped the car and stared at me, right into my eyes. I felt sick and looked out the window. I glanced at the rearview mirror and he was staring at me. I looked away. I glanced over and saw him bouncing. I looked down, and I saw him, pleasuring himself. I started to feel sick and cry. He stared in my eyes and finished, groaning. He zipped himself up, drove me to the pool and dropped me off and said, I'd better not see you again. I was greeted at the pool by my friends, all who thought that I was super cool for being arrested. But I was sick for a week, but I told no one. To preface, I was 16 years old at the time this took place, and I was living in southeast Missouri where I grew up. I had just started my first job at a Hardee's as a fast food cook. It was a nice teen job to keep me out of trouble and provide a little money for getting into trouble, but the job happened to be in a rougher side of town. I was the only white boy who worked there, and on top of that, I was young and naive. During my rebellious streak against the constraints of school and conservative family values, I started smoking weed. At my work, everyone smoked and did some harder drugs too. Fast forward to working at my job for a few months, and I became closer with several coworkers. One of my managers, who I will call Bailey, really liked me because I busted my butt and actually did my job and several of their jobs too. Bailey was one of those people that never had a dull moment in their life. She had kids, was constantly seeing some random guys, and was a bit of a manipulator. You see, I was so naive that everyone around me would take advantage of me by selling me some just crap weed for $20 a gram or make me do their work for them. Nonetheless, Bailey befriended me, and I would occasionally buy subpar weed from her current boyfriend, Marcus. This led to me hanging out with her, and I am not exaggerating when I say seeing things and hearing things that teenagers should not see nor hear. For example, one time Bailey was walking with a limp one day at work, and when I asked her what was wrong, she brought me into our storage closet at work and proceeded to roll up her pant leg to her thigh and revealed a nasty crater that, in my not medical opinion, appeared to be infected. Then she said, "I injected bad rock last night and it's killing me." When I asked her, "Why don't you go to the hospital?" she said that she could not due to medical costs and the fact that she had a newborn daughter at home, thus the government would take her daughter away. So, that should paint a picture of what my work environment looked like. Well, one day I was driving around with my friend who also smoked, and we unfortunately ran out of weed, so I called Bailey on a Saturday night and asked her if Marcus had any. Bailey replied to come through. My friend at the same time, who I'll call Ben, was with me and was totally down to buy sketchy weed from sketchy people, even though I told him that we would have to go to her crack house, and this is where things got interesting. Ben and I pulled up to a rundown duplex that looked like it was damn near abandoned besides the light coming through the windows. We both walked up and started knocking on Bailey's door. Marcus answered and let us in. We told him that we were there for some weed and Marcus was cool with it, but explained that he would need a ride to his plug. Since Ben was driving and was very carefree, he didn't even think twice before obliging the offer. Subsequently, it was just Bailey and I alone in her living room where she immediately told me, "I'm so glad you're here. I just got my tax refund and people have been acting strange lately." I wasn't particularly surprised. In fact, I was used to Bailey's paranoia and absurd lifestyle. However, I am an inquisitive person, and with nothing else to do or say, I started asking why to entertain her delusions. Bailey explained that word got out that she had received a few $1,000s from her government refund, and Bailey, not believing in banks, stashed that in her house that looked like it was ready to fall in. Furthermore, Bailey said that everyone knew it would be easy pickings since they knew she wasn't going to call the police. I didn't quite question this, but I was left to wonder what the hell my presence would do. I certainly didn't appear intimidating. Why was she so happy that I was there? It had been 5 minutes of this talk when a car pulled up, specifically a white Monte Carlo that I saw around work before. Bailey and I were watching out the window when she exclaimed, "Oh, that's Sherry. I wonder why she's here." Sherry came to the door and was definitely on meth. I could tell because Missouri, and particularly rural Missouri, has a huge meth problem, so you can see it more often than you would think. Some of the symptoms include wild eyes, delirious fast-paced conversation, very exciting and intense persona, and running off of pure wild-ass emotions. Anyways, Sherry started talking manically about her day and such. To be honest, I can't really remember what she said exactly because I'd learned to tune out tweakers, but it got to the point where she revealed why she had come. Sherry started asking Bailey if she could watch the baby for the night. I sat back and knew that things were about to start unfolding badly. Bailey promptly told Sherry that she was hanging out at the house tonight with me and Marcus whenever he gets back. Sherry looked at me shocked with a bit of contempt, as if she just noticed me and thought of me as an annoyance. She began asking who I was and what my name was. I couldn't respond before Bailey answered for me and said, "That's AJ, just a coworker of mine. His dad's a cop, and he needs somewhere to smoke." I was just as taken aback as Sherry was because my dad wasn't a cop, but I wasn't about to let some random tweaker know that. Sherry looked completely surprised and resumed asking if she could watch Bailey's newborn for the night, completely forgetting about my existence once again. After about the 10th time of Bailey refusing, Sherry finally got to the point and left right away without even saying goodbye to me and barely a goodbye to Bailey. Being a naive little bumpkin, I attributed this bizarre interaction to Bailey's bizarre lifestyle. However, I knew for sure that I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. It had been about 10 minutes since Ben left with Marcus, and I was now anxious with nothing to comfort me but Bailey's wild theories. Bailey and I began discussing how weird that interaction with Sherry was, considering Sherry just randomly showed up and asked Bailey for her freaking newborn daughter. And it was weird. To provide some context, Bailey's crack house was located off of a country road in the middle of the woods. It was completely out of the way, and it is such an oddly specific request that made no sense. I honestly didn't like where this was going, and quickly my mind began racing. I asked Bailey point blank, "Why did you lie about my dad being a cop?" Bailey explained that people after her money won't mess with a cop's son. I hated hearing this, and I knew then and there that I had to leave, but I couldn't go anywhere as Ben, my ride, was still with Marcus, and due to living in the woods, there were no neighbors despite living in a duplex. Now, Ben had been gone for about 20 minutes, and that's when I saw another car pull into her driveway and slowly started creeping up toward the house. I didn't recognize the car right away, and that's when Bailey ran to the window and said, "Ah, crap, that's DeMarco." DeMarco was her old ex who had recently gotten out of jail and was friends with Sherry from what I could recollect from work stories. My heart leapt out of my chest as I started to put pieces of the puzzle together. The car gets to the front of Bailey's house and the lights turn off. Bailey and I stare blankly out the window as we see 3 silhouettes of men in the car. Instantly, I was mortified and gripped by the inescapable claws of fear. Some say you either have fight or flight, but they always forget about the third option, freezing. Next, I saw DeMarco get out of the car wearing all black jeans and a dark long-sleeved shirt while the other 2 people remained in the car. DeMarco quickly approached the front door and Bailey and I were terrified. Bailey turned to me and whispered, "Lock the door, quick, lock the door." I had always imagined myself as the courageous person who would charge in a dire situation and be the hero. But when the time came, I froze. I just couldn't move as I was paralyzed by fear. Bailey, seeing that I was petrified, hastily leapt past me and locked the deadbolt as soon as DeMarco reached the door. DeMarco began banging loud on the door. "Bailey! Bailey! Let me in!" in a maniacal voice full of desperation. Bailey had her shoulder and body pressed in the door and shouted back, "I'm not opening this door if you're on something, DeMarco." Time had slowed down. DeMarco responded a few seconds later with, "I won't be. I know your white boy's in there." My heart, which I thought was already in my feet, sank into the floor. Still frozen, Bailey looked at me and reasoned that it was somehow safe to open the door without consulting me or looking out the window to see if the silhouettes were still in the car. I wanted to scream no and slam the door with every muscle fiber I had, but I was still frozen. Unable to move, I helplessly watched as the door slowly opened to reveal DeMarco, who was staring back at us with a sinister smile and shark eyes, rubbing his hands together. Bailey, wasting no time to put herself between me and him, said, "What are you doing here? What do you want?" DeMarco wiped away his grin and focused on Bailey, and DeMarco calmly said, "I wanted to stop by to see how you and DeMarcus are doing, but I see you have company," as he looked back over Bailey's shoulder and into my soul. Bailey replied that I was here on drug business and was waiting for my friend to come pick me up, so he had to move his car. After a few moments, DeMarco looked like he was thinking very hard and said, "Alright, I'll leave you be. See you around." As he turned around, I saw in his jean pocket a pair of black leather gloves. I gulped as Bailey shut the door and locked it. We watched as the car slowly backed out of the driveway with the silhouettes not moving at all and onto the road, where they turned on their lights and drove off into the night. 2 minutes after DeMarco left and I was slowly regaining my senses, Ben turned down the driveway. He and Marcus got out of the car talking and being friendly like they knew each other since kindergarten. I didn't care. I was exhausted and traumatized. I was pretty sure that I somehow avoided Bailey being killed, and I could have been collateral for being within her proxy. I also didn't know if DeMarco was going to be back or not, but I wanted to leave before I found out. So I grabbed the weed from Marcus and said goodbye to Bailey as I grabbed Ben and gave him the most "we have to leave right now" look that I could muster. In the car, I frantically explained everything to Ben, and he silently listened to me and said, "That's super sketchy. I don't think it was the tax return they were after, though. Marcus just told me that he's looking to starting to run drugs from St. Louis and asked me if I could help. Apparently, he just got his first big shipment in, and it wasn't weed." And that was it for me. That was the final straw that made the 17-year-old me wake up. To think that my life was put in danger for some just crap weed spooked me to my core. I never bought drugs from Bailey again, and soon after I quit my job, but that was for a whole different reason. Luckily, nothing that I am aware of ever came from this. However, the reason this story sticks with me is because I know to trust my gut instinct, and my gut instinct told me that I was in serious danger that night. Moreover, I am completely ashamed looking back and seeing that I froze. Nestled in the center of Warren County, Kentucky, lies the small town of Bowling Green. Its small size and unassuming nature belie the fact that it's actually the third largest city in the state. In the last several decades, the town has seen a massive economic boom, and its stature within the state has grown as well. The town is home to the famed Corvette Museum and Factory, Western Kentucky University, now the second largest college in the state, the headquarters of Fruit of the Loom, and the Lost River Cave, one of the most beautiful and unique natural wonders of the United States. With its scenic beauty and thriving economy, Bowling Green has become a beacon of prosperity for the entire state. However, not all that long ago, things were much different in Bowling Green. Back in 1948, the town was just starting to stretch its feet, with a brand new Union underwear factory opening up during this time, which provided a greatly needed boost to the town's economy. Dr. Charles Martin and his wife Martha lived in relative luxury due to a lifestyle afforded to them by Dr. Martin's status as a prominent physician in town. They lived on the outskirts of downtown Bowling Green in an elegant yet imposing mansion across the street from Fairview Cemetery, where they raised their son Stonewall Martin. The mansion, where the Martins would live for 30 years, was bought by the family in 1918 and was considered a local landmark by the population during this time. The Martins were well known in the community for their extravagant parties they would often hold in their home, and on more than one occasion possibly tried to set up their son with someone he could marry. As the years went on and Stonewall grew older, their efforts grew fruitless, and Stonewall would find himself a bachelor at the age of 52. Harry Edward Kilgore was born on February 28, 1923. He lived in Glasgow, Kentucky, and much like the Martins, the Kilgores were also well known in their hometown as Harry's grandfather owned the town newspaper. Despite this, Harry's early childhood must have been filled with hardship, as his father Reed Kilgore took his own life in 1925, leaving his mother Ella to take care of Harry and his sister alone, though she did eventually remarry. In his youth, Harry developed an interest in music and sought schooling in Glasgow before moving to nearby Bowling Green to attend Western Kentucky University. There he met Ruth Ann McKinney, a fellow WKU student who was a few years younger than him. Despite the year gap, a connection formed between the two of them, and they quickly became an item. The two students eventually crossed paths with George Daggett, who was 35 at the time and a music professor at WKU, as well as the head of the piano department. George and Harry were said to have become very good friends and would spend days and weeks together at a time. George himself said that he only gave extra attention to him because of Harry's interest in music, though this would come into question much later on. Around this time, Ruth Ann McKinney came into the company of Stonewall Martin, most likely at a party or some other social function. Despite the 30-plus year age gap between them, the two apparently hit it off, as the two are soon married on June 23rd of 1948, leaving shortly after that on their honeymoon. Neither of their lives would ever be the same when they returned. Just a few days after Ruth and Stonewall Martin left Bowling Green, on June 29th, under the cover of darkness, Harry Kilgore drove his car to a wheat field close by Fairview Cemetery. He then grabbed a revolver and walked the remaining distance to the home of Charles and Martha Martin. There had been some debate over the murder weapon used, though court transcripts clearly state a revolver was used. Kilgore broke in through the door and entered the home, where he caught Dr. Martin by surprise in the front hallway. Without hesitation, Harry fired several shots at Dr. Martin, one of which hit him in the head. The wounded Dr. Martin tried to flee back into his bedroom, but the 80-year-old retired physician was no match for the much younger Harry, and as he fled into his bedroom, Kilgore fired several more rounds into the doctor. Harry then shot Martha Martin in the back of the head as well when she attempted to flee. Evidence collected by police and later Harry's own testimony showed that Harry had spent a great deal inside the Martin home after committing the murders. He allegedly tormented the Martins further, even in death, by abusing their corpses with a flashlight and shooting them both several more times. After stealing some personal items from the family, Harry left the Martin home and later told police that he disposed of the gun by throwing it into the Barron River as he fled Bowling Green and drove back to Glasgow. Once there, he sought refuge with his mother Ella, where he would be found later by police. The next morning at around 7 a.m., the bodies of Dr. Martin and his wife were found by two workers who were scheduled to be on the property that morning. Police were quickly called to the scene and they soon had a lead on the case. Working from a tip, police traveled to Glasgow to talk to Harry. They found him in his car, parked right in front of his mother's house. Police asked Harry to come back to Bowling Green, which Harry did willingly. A search of Harry's car came up with several of the Martins' belongings, including Martha's purse, and a flashlight with broken glass along with .32 caliber shell casings. These were later used to tie Harry to the murders during the trial. In Harry's original confession, he took full credit for the murders and didn't name or list anyone else as an accomplice. He stated that he was angry with the Martins because their son Stonewall had lured his girlfriend Ruth Ann away from him, and he killed Stonewall's parents as an act of revenge. From the very onset of the case, Harry's sanity was continually called into question, and Harry changed his statement several times after his original confession. After being judged as sane enough to stand trial, Kilgore pled guilty to 2 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Though 14 months later, after receiving his sentence and being returned to jail, Kilgore made a surprise confession, one that sent ripples through the case, and to this day is a source of controversy and mystery. Despite originally claiming to have committed the murder alone, he now claimed to have had an accomplice, his music professor, George Daggett. According to Harry's confession, George Daggett and Harry, along with Ruth Ann, concocted a plan for Ruth Ann to lure in Stonewall Martin and use him to steal his parents' vast estate. Ruth Ann was to marry Stonewall, then George and Harry were to murder both of Stonewall's parents so their assets would be inherited by Stonewall. Then, after enough time had passed, they were to murder Stonewall and have Ruth Ann inherit the entire estate. The three of them were there to share the money and live together in luxury for the rest of their lives. Harry's testimony was heavily scrutinized due to his mental state. Doctors took note of his depravity and desire to kill, and this caused others to question if Harry was telling the truth. Nonetheless, based off Harry's testimony, an indictment of accessory and extortion was handed down on George Daggett. For his part, George fiercely denied the allegations and provided a timeline of events that occurred on the night of June 29th. George stated Harry came to his apartment very distraught and asked the professor to come to the university with him. The two made their way to the music building but left after seeing that the building was occupied. The two walked around town for a time before George returned to his apartment and bid Harry goodbye sometime around midnight. George would even testify to Harry's mental instability throughout his time as a student at WKU, including his delusions and threats to kill members of his own family. but several key factors and pieces of evidence would cast doubt on Daggett's innocence. Most damningly, Harry testified that the revolver used in the murders was stolen from a former roommate of George Daggett's. The gun had been stolen about 6 months before the murder and 4 months after George had moved out of the property. Friends and students reported George and Harry had spent a lot of time together in the months leading up to the murders, though George continued to assert that he was just helping shepherd Harry's growing interest in music. George Daggett would resign from his position at WKU as his trial commenced. George would later be convicted by a jury of his peers and sentenced to 11 years in prison. However, his convictions were later overturned due to lack of evidence, and another trial would end in the exact same way, with the charges against George eventually being dismissed. The prosecuting attorney in the trial believed that George was the mastermind behind the murders, as well as the contributing factor in Harry's downfall, but did not have enough evidence to prove this. George fled Kentucky after the trial and moved to Detroit. He apparently found work as a piano player and would spend the rest of his life there until dying of a heart attack in 1963, although the circumstances surrounding his death are shrouded in mystery to this day. For her part, Ruth Ann was never investigated and a connection to the murders was never formally established. Although some involved in the case suspected Ruth Ann and even Harry's mother, Ella Kilgore, were involved in the murders and the conspiracy, nothing ever came of these rumors, and both women lived the rest of their lives in peace. Tragedy would continue to follow the remainder of the Martin family, though, as Stonewall would die 9 years later in 1957. Whether or not it was a conspiracy or a random tragic coincidence, Ruth Ann McKinney eventually ended up with the Martin family fortune, which, according to the sources close to the case, she was in a real hurry to collect. Ruth Ann allegedly visited the Martins' bank daily for weeks, hounding tellers and bankers for her late husband's money. Fate, it would seem, had different plans for the money, which was legally willed to Ruth Ann only under the condition that she not remarry, which she would eventually do years later. The remaining sum of money was then donated to various charities as stated in the Martins' will. Harry was coincidentally up for parole in 1957 and was promptly denied by the parole board. Harry's sanity was questioned several more times in the intervening years, although he was judged as mentally competent and to have known the difference between right and wrong each time. He served about 16 years of his life sentence before finally earning an early release on parole. As part of his parole agreement, Harry and Ruth Ann left Bowling Green and moved to Fort Pierce, Florida, where the two lived together intermittently until Harry's death one fateful morning in 1981. Harry had left his house to go on a bike ride and was struck down by a passing motorist. Harry died in the street and was laid to rest in Florida, leaving behind a mystery with more questions than answers. The murders were a big news story in Bowling Green, with many reporters and journalists from surrounding towns traveling to Bowling Green to cover the story and trial. Questions surrounding the case still remain today, and documents covering the murders as well as documents from both trials can be found in the Kentucky History Museum located on WKU's campus. As for the town, Bowling Green moved on from the murders and has become a symbol of Kentucky's renewed economic growth. The mansion the Martins were tragically killed in still stands today and has exchanged hands several times since the murders. The house has become infamous in Bowling Green's history and is referred to as Murder Mansion by locals in reference to its bloody past. A mythology of sorts has developed around the house in the decades since then. It was reported that when the house was sold in the 60s after remaining vacant since the murders, bloodstains could still be seen on the hardwood floors. And as is typical for such crime scenes, rumors of paranormal activity in the house have persisted since, though previous owners have denied any such activity having ever occurred in the house, and these reports remained unsubstantiated. Previous owners have also taken the house's reputation in stride, carrying on the Martins' tradition of holding annual parties at the mansion, with some of these parties falling on Halloween. The newest owners of the house have distanced themselves from the mansion's infamous past and currently discourage sightseers from taking pictures of the house and visiting the property. It seems despite moving on and establishing a new identity for itself, Bowling Green and the Murder Mansion will never quite escape the shadow of its violent history. This story ends on an unexpected and somewhat poignant note. While investigating the story, someone close to the case and to Fairview Cemetery reported to me that Ruth Ann McKinney had been back to Bowling Green as recently as 2012 to see if her grave marker next to her first husband, Stonewall Martin, was still there and available. Despite the tragic events that have marked her life since marrying him, it seems Ruth Ann still held deep affection for her late husband. It should be noted that though Ruth Ann and Harry Kilgore lived together after his release from prison, they were never married. Ruth Ann would become the last survivor of the Martins' murder saga, as she passed away in November of 2017. Whatever role she may or may not have had played in this mystery, let us hope that Ruth Ann McKinney and the rest of the Martin family have finally found their peace. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are some super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday nights. Love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, hazel eyes are a myth.